welcome to Pocketables Weekly News Roundup number 8. It's hard to believe that we've been up to this for 2 months now, and this is unfortunately the first one that's been delayed. There were a couple of equipment issues that stalled me twice, actually, yesterday and, well, once this morning, so I'm currently 0 for 3 on recording these news briefs. And last week we had to, well, let's get to our first news item. Pocketables is on a new web host. We ended up having to move. We were told by our previous web host that we were using too much CPU time and to figure it out, or GTFO. And they weren't really a whole ton of help on the figure it out side, so we ended up moving. We did end up finding our problem. There were 250,000 files in one of our old directories from 2008. Don't know why it was suddenly an issue right now, but it looks like there was a file system issue that was causing excessive CPU time. With that said, let's go ahead and get into our 2 PC hardware items this week. The first one, NVIDIA had to delay the RTX3070 launch. I think that this is probably a manufacturing delay, not some of the more conspiracy focused, oh, they're trying to steal AMD's thunder on the big Navi launch lines that I've heard from some people. This looks more like they want to guarantee that there will be sufficient supply for the 3070. These RTX 3000 cards are the biggest jump NVIDIA has made available in a long time and are actually priced reasonably for that. And I think because of that, they may have underestimated the amount of demand there's going to be, especially for cards like the 3090. That's a $1,500 card, and people were literally lined up outside places like Micro Center on launch day to get a 3090. If you told me people were lined up on launch day to get a 3070, which is going to be, what I believe, $499, I'd believe that. A $1,500 card, although I'm sure that there are people who need it and can use it, and I'd love to get one myself, doesn't seem like the kind of investment that I anticipate people being lined up outside a retailer to get their hands on. I just wouldn't imagine that there are enough people in a location to cause that kind of demand. But apparently there were, so I can only imagine what 3070 launch day is going to look like, especially if there just aren't enough cards available from the retailers. So with that said, they've delayed the launch. It'll be on October 29th now. And hopefully this means that there will be substantially more cards available. Other PC hardware news, a company that you might sound vaguely familiar but not actually be familiar with, ASRock Rack, the enterprise division of ASRock, has launched a new Threadripper motherboard. This is actually server focused instead of high-end desktop platform. This is a $700 motherboard that has the Threadripper oriented for front to back cooling, which I think is fantastic. I wish more consumer boards would do that. This is giving them a little bit more room to play with in the PCI Express expansion area. We're getting 3x16 slots that are double width in addition to an 8x slot. This is definitely a server-focused board. As such, there are features that are just outright missing you would normally expect to see on a consumer platform. There's no onboard audio. There is a BMC, which is a typical server feature. There's no gigabit Ethernet. All the networking is done by Intel chips, which is a little bit odd for an AMD product. But we're getting Intel X710 10G base T and Intel, I believe it's 228, 229, 2.5G base T ports for a total aggregate of 25 gigs of available networking just out of the box. Other features, the USB on the rear panel is rather limited. It's getting a pair of USB 3.2 Gen 1 and a pair of USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports. That's it, 4 USB ports. That's not terrible, that's not great. One of them is a Type-C as well, which is a nice touch. That said, consumer platforms, you're typically used to getting, nearly 10 USB ports on the back these days. There is a PS2 port, which I think is a nice touch. I love having that for my Model M keyboard, which is I mean, God, 1989 at this point, I believe. So it's a 31-year-old keyboard. Still works fantastic to this day. Anyone who would love to hear more about Model M keyboards, let us know, and we'll touch on that in a video at some point. So who is this board for? I mean, front-to-back airflow is not typical for consumer platforms, even though I wish it was. The I/O sounds kind of limited in some places, although there are some headers on the main board for additional USB. Storage isn't super huge. It's got two M2 2210s, 6 SATA ports total, 2 of which are what are called SATA DOM ports. These provide additional power for a disk-on module. Normally you use these for booting things like ESXi or Hyper-V or FreeNAS without using a dedicated SATA port or M2 port that would normally be used for storage. 2 of the SATA ports are provided by an additional AS Media controller. The SATA ports from the AS Media and the SATA ports for the chipset both support RAID 0 and RAID 1, which is nice if you need to make some little arrays. We also get an Oculink port for additional U2 cabled storage. So storage is pretty, I'm not going to say it's expansive, but it's pretty reasonable. It's not what I would expect on a server platform that was storage focused, however, where I'd expect to see more M2s, more SATA ports, more cabled U2 options to do some kind of large, we'll say 12 drive array just on the main board. I believe the focus on this board with the front to back cooling, which should keep everything nice and cool provided you get the right heat sink and have your case designed properly. With the double wide expansion slots, I think this is really focusing people who are going to get 3 high-end graphics cards, throw them in there, and do one of a few things. This would be an excellent board if you wanted to use it as a render device. You can put a high-end Threadripper in it, even though Threadripper is limited to 256 gigs of RAM compared to the 2 terabyte that Epic is capable of. That's still enough for a render farm. And you'd be able to use a consumer chip and save a ton compared to a normal server board and chip combo there. The lack of ECC memory might be disappointing to a few people, but especially if you're doing GPU memory, you can get 3 Quadros, 3 3080s. You're not going to fit 3 3090s in it, unfortunately, because they're double wide, not triple wide. It is an ATX board. Do something like that and just render till your heart's content with whatever you're doing. The other market that I see a board for like this is in virtualized workstations or VM environments. Yeah, the RAM's a little low for a typical VM environment, but if your virtual machines are used for thin clients in a professional capacity or even a gaming capacity, I've seen people do things like was that Unraid and put multiple gamers on one system. You could do something like that with this board. So it certainly has lots of potential, and I really like the airflow choices. There's a couple of things missing. I mentioned the onboard audio is a bit limiting, or the lack of onboard audio, I should say. Personally, I don't use onboard audio with desktops anyway right now. My audio for my desktop is courtesy of a Behringer Euphoria device. Prior to that, I was using, granted this was PCI, Delta 1010 LT card. I've used ESI Maya cards, which I really liked the ESI Maya since that gave me phantom power in a PCI slot. People who are doing video production right now, I could see using something like this for video capture, where I could stuff 3 of those cards with Blackmagic capture cards or Magewell cards, and the lack of memory, once again, not a huge problem. It's the CPU that's going to be the big issue there, and having a good graphics card in it. So overall, lots of potential in this board. I would love to see more boards like it. At $700, it's a bit pricey for a consumer application, but those people who are lining up to buy 3090s may have bigger budgets than I do as well. I mean, I'm still using Westmere Xeons, which, by the way, no one figured out our background before was a dual-core Westmere die shot. Anyone want to tell me what this one is? I'd love to hear it in the comments below. But I'm using a dual socket Xeon workstation that I purchased on eBay 4 or 5 years ago at this point. I've just continued to upgrade and got myself a pair of 5690s in there at this point. And even when I upgrade, I'm probably leaning towards staying in that line, since the price to performance of, say, a pair of E5 2690s, which would let me use my existing memory, is pretty good compared to buying new. In fact, if anyone knows a good main board that would take a pair of E5 2690 V1 or V2 chips, let me know. And I specifically say V1 and V2 because V3 and V4 means buying DDR4 RAM, which I don't have right now. Moving on to googly news. And no, I don't mean some googly eyes bouncing around on a Roomba. Google launched some hardware this week. Well, I guess we'll start with the simplest one. There's a new Nest Audio. This is basically a direct replacement for the original Google Home, and has continued the tradition of the Google Home shortcomings, which is that there's no 3.5 millimeter audio out. On a device that size, I honestly think that's inexcusable, but it also seems to be the way Google wants to do things. It doesn't matter to them that I have high-end speakers in several rooms in my house if they're not Bluetooth. Which, by the way, the Bluetooth on the Home Minis has been kind of flaky on some of the updates. So I don't really think that's an acceptable solution. But that said, if your smart speakers are your primary listening device, the new Nest Audio provides more bass and more volume compared to the original Google Home, although it's still not on the same level as the Home Max, which at this point, none of their devices naming quite lines up. And honestly, with a name like Nest Audio, I had expected a new Chromecast audio. I'm kind of disappointed. On a more exciting note, there is a new Chromecast with Google TV. I hope this doesn't mean the end of the standalone Chromecast, because I personally use those and don't have a ton of need for the embedded smart functionality, but I do appreciate that it's there. The new Chromecast with Google TV includes a remote, includes smart functionality that is not quite the same as Android TV, but is still fairly competent based on what I've seen so far, for people that don't like using their smartphone to control their Chromecast, or for people who have older relatives that just don't have smartphones and can't cut the cord because of that. This is a pretty compelling little device at $50. Personally, I'd rather use a device like that than even have a smart TV, because when that device is out of date, I can simply replace it. When my smart TV is out of date, it becomes dumb. And I actually have several smart TVs at this point that I don't use the smart functionality on because, one, the Wi-Fi chip burned out, and another just doesn't have features that I want it to have. So I'm back to using the Chromecasts. Personally, I'd love to see more dumb panels, and let's just make the external bricks more comparable. The idea of the TV being disposable doesn't really appeal to me on several fronts. That small aside, the new Chromecast looks compelling. It's got 4K support, and we also get a bevy of high-end audio features for things like surround sound systems, although you'll need your TV to output to them, as the device itself is HDMI only. On the note of Chromecasts, I would love to see an enterprise-focused Chromecast. I personally use them at work for several projectors and conference rooms where running a cable was just prohibitive. And just throwing a Chromecast on the network made most of the problems go away fairly quickly. That said, they're not perfect. I don't have a way to restrict who can and can't use them at any given time. I don't have a way to restrict people on the Wi-Fi from busting other people's meetings. Not that that happens a whole ton in my environment, but there are certainly environments where I could see that would be problematic. And I would have seen the occasional person grab the wrong projector when I've got 3 meetings going on and somebody grabs the wrong room. It interrupts, and it's just a small to-do every time something like that happens. Being able to say only people with this G Suite account can use this Chromecast at this time would be a fantastic way to solve that. So I'm sure that they won't add that as a software feature, but a new hardware device, some kind of Chromecast Enterprise, would be greatly appreciated if they would ever build one. And last but not least, Google launched new Pixel devices this week. We have the new Pixel 4a 5G, which is a mouthful of a name and kind of terrible on its own, and a new Pixel 5. Honestly, between the two, the 4a 5G is the more compelling device for me. The devices are fairly similar. We're getting the same Snapdragon 765G chipset, so it's not like the 5 is any faster there. The 4a 5G only has 6 gigs of RAM, the 5 has 8. That's not a huge difference, although that may, in some edge cases, be a make or break choice. Personally, once we get past 6 gigs of RAM, I think we're fine on smartphones right now. Both devices are coming with OLED screens with a 2340 by 1080 resolution. That said, the 4a 5G is actually coming with a larger screen at 6.2 inches. The Pixel 5 is getting a smaller screen at 6 inches with a higher refresh rate. Battery-wise, the 4a 5G weighs in at just over 3,800 milliamp hours. The Pixel 5 weighs in at just under 4,100 milliamp hours. So we've got a 200 milliamp hour battery difference. I personally expect battery life between the two to be a wash. The 5 has a higher refresh rate screen and more memory to feed. The 4a 5G has a slightly larger screen to feed, but less memory and a lower refresh rate. So between those, I expect 200 milliamp hours of battery to not make a huge difference. Things that are different, we're both getting 18 watt fast charging. Only the 5 has wireless charging. I personally have not seen wireless charging as a compelling feature on smartphones. I am more excited about fast charging. So being able to plug my 7 Pro 5G into a cable and pick it up 15 minutes later and have, gained, we'll say 70% battery life, to me is great. I absolutely love that. I keep a fast charger, not at my bed where I can plug it in overnight and charge it overnight, but in my studio and near my office, where if in the middle of the day I look and I'm at 30% because I've been using it all day and the screen's been on, or I turned the brightness up higher than I normally would, I can plug it in and come back in a few minutes. So wireless charging to me is something that we need to adopt on smaller devices, things like smartwatches, where plugging it in and having exposed contacts is space that could have better been used for more battery capacity or other features. Moving on, they have the same exact rear camera array, 12.2 megapixel main camera. It's the same main camera that they've used for a couple of generations now with minor adjustments. It's a competent design, 1.4 micropixel, dual pixel phase detection, f1.7, 77 degree with optical stabilization. All in all, not bad. I know it's not the 100 megapixel sensor that Samsung crammed into the S20. I don't think that the megapixel race is necessarily doing anyone any favors just based on the sensor size in a lot of phones. We're getting a wide angle camera on them this year. It's a 16 megapixel, 1 micrometer, f207 degree, ultra wide. Once again, that looks like a competent camera. I haven't seen it in action, but I don't anticipate anyone being disappointed with either of those, even if they're not necessarily considered the top camera this year. I expect them to at least be in the top 10. I/O connectivity, both devices get USB-C. The 4a 5G gets a 3.5 millimeter headphone jack. The 5 gets nothing. I don't see a reason to continue excluding headphone jacks. I think we've kind of proven at this point that it does nothing but irritate people. And the fact that it's been reintroduced on several devices tells me that it was a mistake from the first place. I'd love to see it come back. That, to me, is probably one of the reasons that the 4a 5G is the more compelling device. Wireless capacity, everybody gets 802.11c, Wave 2, and Bluetooth 5 as well as NFC. Just standard features, no Wi-Fi 6 this year. Other features, both devices get dual speakers, both have the same exact 5G capacity, although the 4A 5G is going to be available with and without millimeter wave support. So there will be a cheaper option. I believe it's $4.99 for the cheaper, $5.99 for the more expensive, depending on whether or not you need millimeter wave. The 5 is just going to be $6.99 no matter what. And then the Pixel 5 gets a IP68 rating. Everyone gets the same dual speaker config and same nano SIM plus eSIM config. Right. So these two devices are fairly competent phones. The 765G is no slouch. The pricing's a little higher than I'd like it to be across the board, and that's not really aimed at Google. I think a lot of the trends right now have pushed smartphones into prices that are just absurd. The idea that some phones at this point are approaching $2,000 is, I mean, that's more than I spent on my car. So why would I spend that on a phone that's going to get me 3 years when the car has already made it past then? Maybe the solution there is I should have spent more money on my car, but it's, a work vehicle that has to move things. It doesn't necessarily have to look pretty. Moving on from that, I don't like the hole punch in the screen. I know I've said this before. I don't like notches. I don't like hole punches. I feel like phones are taking a step backwards in doing that. No one would be happy if they got a 13-inch laptop or some kind of ultralight notebook with no bezels, and the solution to where do we put the webcam was punch a hole out in the center of the screen. I don't know why we think that's an acceptable option on a phone, especially with the costs as high as they are. I know some people don't like bezels and think that they look bad. This is just worse. So, that said, that's the 4A 5G, that's the Pixel 5. I think they're priced fairly competitively. I do think the prices are higher across the market than I think they should be. And between the two, probably the 4A would be the more optimal choice from my point of view. Yes, 90 hertz and wireless charging is nice. I don't think it's that nice to spend $100 on it. I'd rather have the headphone jack, which may sound like I'm beating a dead horse, but I've had to live without one with my 7 Pro 5G, and I've decided that I'm not willing to continue living without one. I had to buy a Bluetooth audio adapter for my car, and it's terrible. And it's not an issue with the adapter, it's an FM transmitter that the radio picks up. I can drive certain places, and there's RF interference that interferes with either the Bluetooth or with the FM transmission, and I know that's not an issue if I could have used a cable. And I can't because I can't plug in a charging cable and an audio adapter at the same time. In fact, I think there's the solution there. If we're going to take away the headphone jack, you need to give phones 2 USB-C ports. Just give me 2 ports on the bottom. That way I can charge it and I can plug in an audio adapter. If that doesn't seem like a sane solution, maybe we should just put the headphone jacks back. With all of that said, thank you for watching, and thank you to those of you who support Pocketables on Patreon. You help make content like this possible. You also help make things like our move this past week possible, where the site was not producing the revenue it should have because we had to migrate. If you're interested in helping support Pocketables and making content like this possible, and potentially increasing some of the content that we do produce, check it out. There'll be a link in the description below. I want to thank Electrix for providing our opening and closing themes. If anyone likes those themes or needs stuff like that themselves, definitely check his channel out and send him a message. He's fantastic to work with. Once again, thank you for watching. If you have any questions, if we missed something that you saw this week that you wanted to hear about, If we didn't cover something deep enough, let us know in the comments below and we will follow up there or in a separate video as is appropriate.